Yeah, we get on. But Joe, it's lovely
Yeah.
to meet you, albeit virtually. This is
Thank you
so
for
cool.
having me.
Yes, this is so cool. And another Joe in my life, Joe Hall, who,
Oh,
we've partnered up with for the Live Life Connected, which I believe you delivered a workshop for those guys. Was just so impressed. Joe was like, "You have to meet the other Joe of the Wilderness Foundation and have a conversation with her because whatever you did that day, it really impacted Joe Hall and all the people that were involved. So it's a pleasure to have
yeah.
you
Well,
on.
she's so inspiring, isn't she? I mean, she's just one of those life forces. She just kind of energizes wherever she goes. She's wonderful. So yeah, no, thank you. So lovely, lovely kind of people around, which is just such a blessing.
Yeah, and it's just nice to make these contacts and being local in Essex, which is always wonderful and always sunny, as I like to tell absolutely anyone and everyone that listens. So I thought what we'd do, Joe, if it's
Yeah.
okay, we'd just sort of get like right into it straight away. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about the Wilderness Foundation UK, how you got into it and its aims.
Okay. So Wilderness Foundation UK has been running, gosh, the UK Foundation's been actually active since about 1976. It started in South Africa in about 1956 with this idea that if we took people out into the wilderness, but in an incredibly primitive, simple way, so you weren't in a Land Rover, you weren't in a
Mm.
tent, you weren't in a luxury lodge, you literally were just carrying your backpack on your back. That was it, 5 or 10 this immersion. There was something that happened to people in terms of getting to connect with themselves, but also to connect with the natural world, because you'd taken away all the paraphernalia and all the layering and all the kind of additional things that we put onto our lives where we kind of lose contact. It's a bit like dirty plugs. We kind of lose that essential
Yeah.
contact. So that started up really early on in the 1960s. And our founder was an extraordinary guy called Ian Player, and he was tough. I think the early trails, people didn't have water and all sorts of things. He was rough and rugged. But he was very into the kind of spiritual dimension of nature and wilderness, and he was a strong Jungian. He was just one of the most well-read people, Andy, I've ever met in my
Mm.
whole life. So he would be the person who could quote tracts out of the Bible and poetry, and just
Yeah.
extraordinary. He was a wilderness, rough, wild man. So he then became really friendly with some really significant people in the UK, and in 1976 they founded the Wilderness Foundation here, and it sort of rumbled around and did send people to South Africa. And then I got involved in 1998. I was just returning from living in Luxembourg for 8 years, and had read this book called Shadow and Soul, and it was by Ian, and I'd known him since I was little, and started to think, well, I want to do something around this. I want to
Yeah.
be involved in making a difference, because a lot of work had taken place in South Africa. And I was like, what could we do more of here, and how could we help? And so I got very involved then with fundraising and organizing UK people to go out to South Africa and do wilderness journeys. And then Damalola Taylor died in the early, I think it must have been the end of the 1990, the early 2000. And I started to think, well, gosh, we're doing projects in South Africa that are linking urban youth who've kind of lost their way
Yeah.
into wilderness-based programs that really were very cathartic and therapeutic, and they pulled the whole community around. So, sitting in Essex, I started dreaming about how could we bring some of these models here, because there were crises of our youth in inner cities, and there
Mm.
were crises of our youth who'd lost their way, and what could we do here? And so I founded a program called the Turnaround Project. I started to do the research in about 2002, 2003, and had a lot of people wanting to help and be involved. And then in 2007, we launched the first group of Essex youth, some from Ongar, some from Braintree, Chelmsford, really young people who I think people were kind of like, work with this group because we don't know what to do with them. You
Yeah.
want to try this out, here you go. And so we ended up doing this program, which lasted a year, but it started with a big wilderness therapy program up in Mull. And I was just laughing with someone earlier and saying, why would you take a group of really tough kids to Mull in November when it's dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it's raining and it's cold? But we had this extraordinary experience. And, you know, the guides and the therapists working with the group, we took mentors. So we had mentors, local people from Chelmsford area of Essex who wanted to help youth, signed up and trained as mentors, but they came on trail as well. They were carrying their backpacks up the mountains, and each person had their mentor and vice versa. So we were kind of a bit like a moving army of
Yeah.
Essex moving into Mull, but started to see how dramatic that it was, that if you actually worked with people, if you worked with people in a very human and loving way, but with really good boundaries and respect, you gave them the space to discover what their strengths and capabilities were. And most of these young people were incredibly capable, but they'd never really dug down deep enough to see what they
Yeah.
were able to do. So that was the start. It was an incredibly challenging program, but hugely insightful, hugely beneficial. I'm still close to several of the young people from that first expedition.
From the first trip to Mull. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah,
And actually, Mull is, and that's the island off Scotland.
yeah, it's on the west coast.
That's right. So the guy that I co-founded One You Know Beer with, Rory Fairbairns, is from Mull.
Oh, really?
Funnily
From
enough, yeah,
Territorial? Oh
yeah,
my
yeah.
goodness!
That's where he's from,
How
which is pretty
extraordinary!
cool. It's a mad link, and I mean, I can only imagine. I haven't actually been there myself, but I know it looks like a beautiful and wild place. I can imagine taking these sort of Essex kids out there and what, just a complete change of scenery and existence, and that reconnection with something so raw and so basic that I think for many, I'm sure, kids and adults alike, feels like it's been removed from our lives in so many ways.
Well, I think it's also very beautiful, and I think we need beauty. You know, there's
Mm.
something about beauty that lifts your spirit. You know, I remember one evening we did one-to-one therapy while the rest of the group were playing frisbee on the beach. Then we kind of worked one-to-one just on one of the days, and it was honestly a pristine white sanded
Mm.
beach with, you know, glowing white sand and turquoise blue water and just silence. You know, nobody else. We're the only humans almost on the world in the world. You know, that sort of feeling. And being able to really sit on the beach in a corner out the wind and talk really deeply with the young person about who they are and where they're going and what they want and what motivates them and what do they feel they can offer themselves in the world. And it's such meaningful conversations,
Mm.
nothing trite, you know, really intimate, deep searching, but you're in the same space, both of you. So the therapist, young person are matched in a very kind of mirrored kind of way. It was beautiful. And, you know, we had some terrible rain and we had ice cold weather, but actually the more challenging we've discovered our wilderness journeys are, almost the more our groups benefit. It's
That's
almost,
interesting. Yeah, so the more extreme, for example, the weather on those challenges, the better the results.
yeah, I think it's a funny thing. I always try and avoid the weather, probably because I'm a wuss, because I'm South African. But
Right.
I think when people have to stretch, and I'm sure you find this in your motivational work, when people have to stretch a little bit, it somehow feels more relevant for them,
Yeah.
or they find more aspects of themselves that they never knew they had. So, you know, when you're tired and your pack's heavy, and we had some challenges that came up with behaviors or things that got lost, or, you know, someone discovered they'd left their cup behind at the previous camp, and then you've only got one cup. Okay, so what are we going to do here? You know, we're going to have to come up with a solution. And, you know, we didn't carry endless cups in case someone left it. So I think we cut a plastic milk bottle up and, you know, kept the lid on, but used the
Yeah.
base, and that turned out to be their cup for the rest of the week and things like that. You know, you have to improvise and be smart and find solutions and not just throw a paddy and chuck your backpack down the mountain and have a hissy fit, because then you're not going to have any tea or coffee for the rest of the week. Or let's make it work. And I'm a dreadful let's make it work person. I'm always into fixing and finding a solution. So, but it's good for them to find their own solution. So anyway, so we started Turnaround, which still runs today.
Yeah.
We're in our 13th cycle of the program,
Wow.
which is just beautiful. And, you know, working with a variety of young people who stay incredibly embedded in our hearts because we become so close and we get to
Mm.
know them so well. And then we started a range of other projects here in England, in Essex, working with 13 to 15-year-olds. We did a big survey and said, what age was it that we should really try and harness some change for young people where they could actually really have a chance to process and develop some kind of direction for themselves. And so we run a project called the Out There Academy, and that's been going now since 2014. And we've got a lot more therapy now since then. So we now run face-to-face therapy in the outdoors. We've got about 30 therapists who are outdoor therapists on our team, and we do a lot of group therapy work. So working, with adults who've got addiction issues or domestic violence, or we're working with some asylum seeker youth who are based in Essex. I'm very keen to do something for the Afghan families who are being resettled.
Yeah.
All the time, kind of using nature and wildness and simplicity and quietness and a whole range of intentional values that just help soothe people. And then
Yeah.
when they're soothed, then they can think more clearly.
Yeah, and that's such a beautiful thing that it's sort of, available to so many different demographics and situations, whether that's again addiction, asylum, rehousing, as it were, or
Yeah.
our teens. And I'm just wondering, around the teens, I'm not sure if you've read Joseph Campbell and his wonderful book Hero of a Thousand Faces, and a big part of that book really is that hero's journey, isn't it? That quest, and that was very much part of our archetypical Carl Jung type human nature, this rite of passage that doesn't really exist for most of us in the Western world. And I'm just wondering, is that why that sort of 13 to 15 type age bracket maybe stood out a bit? Because I guess that historically would have been in and around those moments, wouldn't it, of coming out of sort of almost into some form of, you know, early adulthood.
Well, I'm so glad you raised that, because when I first started being very involved in the Wilderness Foundation, rite of passage was something I was really fascinated by. Coming from Africa and looking at a lot of wilderness therapy work came out of the States, where you had Native American
Yeah,
processes and wisdom. And yet we didn't have anything. And I remember doing loads and loads of quests of talking to people and exploring, where could we try and create some kind of ritualistic rite of passage? I mean, if you're Jewish, you've got your bar mitzvah and you've got
yeah,
the community and religion coming around. I guess if you're Catholic, you have your confirmation services. But a lot of people have drifted from religion, so they don't have those old practices anymore. So, gosh, we really struggled. We really struggled to find it. So, what we've done is, kind of borrowed symbolic ways of doing things from other cultures to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of Celtic work, but I haven't really found a way to. We talk a lot. We look at a lot of the Celtic tree stuff and Celtic mythology, but never found that rite of passage. But I think you're right. I think one of the things that's missing is there's none of that kind of staging. Everything's sort of become blurred.
yeah,
It's a bit like, if you're 12, you watch your older brother's 18 movies. There's no kind of like staging, like I need to now wait for the next stage because now I'm at the right. You don't have anything you wait for anymore. It's all just right there. So we use quite a lot of the symbolic metaphorical work. So I'm running a therapy training for outdoor therapists starting tomorrow morning, and one of the things we'll do is build a threshold. We'll build a symbolic threshold, that you're leaving one space and entering another space, and so all these journeying
yeah,
principles. So, we did that on Mull, lugging huge rocks on the beach, and then the young people walking through and shouting to the wind what they're going to leave behind and opening their arms to what they want to walk into. And, the rest of that group celebrating and clapping and, giving them that sort of community spirit. So I guess we've tried to create that in really soft, gentle ways, but without having any real cultural identity to hang it to.
yeah, exactly. But it's still that sense of rite of passage of crossing that threshold, into that the unknown and that hero's journey. And I
Yeah,
just think that's so powerful, and something that, as an adult, and this is why I'd be interested now, I'd almost like to go back and revisit, in that sort of quest or that nature quest. As a guy that I've read his book, is Bill Poltkin. I don't know
oh
if you're
yes,
familiar with. Vera's got
Yes.
a beautiful book, Vision Quest. I think that's what it's called, or
Yeah.
Nature Quest. It's called. But again, would take adults on those nature quests for
Yeah.
days, days whilst fasted into the wilderness. I think predominantly in Australia now, for that opportunity to actually sort of reconnect at some sort of very deep and meaningful spiritual level. I think this stuff is endlessly fascinating, just not even in that rite of passage, but
Yeah.
for adults as well. So how do you find it with adults?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that we've been doing a lot more adult work recently. We were very teenager and children oriented at the foundation, but now we've been doing a lot more adult work recently. And I think it depends on the adult. I
Mm.
think that particularly people who are going through some kind of crisis are very open to that kind of questing. And I think it's funny. I was just doing an interview earlier on a commission that I'm working on in Essex called the Essex Renewal Commission, as a result of COVID. I'm a commissioner on that, and we're saying, what was your biggest takeaway from COVID? And I think that it forced people into a new questioning. I
Mm.
think a lot of people stopped taking things for granted and they started to question again. And I think we needed that slowing down to be able to touch base again with things. We were all moving so fast before COVID. I mean, I know I'm generalizing, but I certainly was. And many people I knew were moving so fast that you don't have the time to really reflect properly. So I think a lot of our adult groups, we actually really encourage reflection. So you might sit in solo for an hour under a tree, or you might do some symbolic, making art from natural materials quietly to reflect how you feel about yourself or your life. And the minute people start reflecting, then that quest comes in, then the questions start coming up, and you're enabling them to start even thinking more about where I am, who I am, where I fit in, how do I fit into the bigger picture of life. So we've borrowed some really beautiful stuff, and we've used it in all of our programs, but mainly turnaround, called the Circle of Courage, and it's a Native American sort of process, and it says for an adolescent to become a healthy adult, we need 4 key elements. The first and most important is a sense of belonging.
Okay.
The second is independence. The third is mastery and skills, and the fourth one is generosity. And it breaks generosity into 2 sections. So it says generosity is around giving and being kind, but it's also about humility. And so in all of our programs, we'll track with our young people, where they feel they're growing their sense of belonging, where they're growing all these different elements. Because in the Native American sort of quest or culture, it was that we need to build these things to really move into adulthood really well. And I think even our adult programs can do the circle of courage. Where am I on these
Absolutely.
scales? Because I think it was Roosevelt said, if we didn't have something good to belong to, we would find something not good to belong to.
Yeah.
So where do we grow belonging? How do we build that sense of not being alone? And aloneness is all one. That's where it comes from. But how do we not be alone? We're a social animal. Where do we fit in? How do we feel connection? And I think what we build in our programs is a connection to yourself, a connection to the other person, but also a connection to the earth. So you kind of have like 3 layers of
Yeah.
belonging.
I
I don't
think
know.
it's so powerful, and no, and I identify with this completely, and especially I think in the space where I've spent a lot of time, which is helping people change their relationship with alcohol. Funnily enough, I think that opens up their minds and ideas to a further quest in life. They're ready to listen anew and actually explore avenues, and they ask those big questions like, "What is this life thing all about?" And I think it feels to me, again generalizing, that so many people are a bit lost at the moment.
Mm.
Again, organized religion and, like we said, all those sort of rituals and rites of passage on the whole definitely are in decline. Therefore lots of people, I just think, are caught in this western trap of consumerism and all these things, and it's a bit like, well, what's this all about? And I think there's so much sort of flatness, 5 out of 10ness, where people are just longing for something, and a lot of that is community, and you're so
Yeah.
right, and a lot of it is connection. In many ways, it was a great book by a guy called Johann Hari, and very much the thesis of that book was the opposite of addiction is connection. And I think community, connection with the nature, and reconnection with thyself is so important. And I think a key element to all of this is the simplicity of just having some time.
Yeah.
Literally just some time to reflect and not being switched on 24/7. You're just trying to get through it all the time, sort of survival mode, just to almost come out of that for
Yeah.
a day or two or whatever it is, just to sit under a tree,
Yeah.
which is something so humanly foundational that we would have done since day dot for all these millennia. That, how many times, anyone listening to this, can they actually say, I've sat under a tree for an hour and just pondered life? I bet you it's
Yeah.
barely anyone.
Yeah, I think and you're right. And I think that's one of the things, that's so fascinating is, we've kind of lived, I'd love to come up with some concept like life interrupters. We've just fast tracked so fast from a very different way of living in probably the last 200 years. We've exploded with busyness and technology and cars and planes and big cities, and everything's just gone mad. And some of the theorists, talk about biophilia hypothesis, that we are predestined to be close and living within nature, and we've exploded away from all of that. And actually, I think psychologically, our psyche, our spirit, hasn't actually been able to catch up. And
Yeah.
and there was a lovely thing about, I can't remember which one was it. It was who was the big, it was Stanley, for example. There was this thing about, he talked about how the porters sort of would talk about the need to walk slowly so that your spirit catches up with you as you're walking. And we laugh when we say we go on a wilderness trail somewhere in the olden days to South Africa on a plane. You never had the time for your spirit to catch up, because
Zoomed
nothing
off.
takes it's like a pregnancy. I think pregnancy is so important because it's 9 months of getting used to something.
Mm.
But I'm sure a lot of people would say, I don't want to be pregnant anymore. If I could flick a switch and, conception, baby,
Right, yeah.
nothing in between. We all seem to, sorry, those are my dogs going mad. We never seem to be able to, we want everything to be too quick. We want everything to happen instantly. We're not going through that kind of growth phase, that things take time, seeds take time, plants take time. I think we want things too quickly, and I
Yeah,
think that's what's happened. I'm
I
sorry
think that's
about the
so
dog.
true. That's okay. I think it's so true. Exactly that. We've evolved all these millennia in a certain way, and it's just in the last 200 years, really, everything's just changed so dramatically, and the speed of change is accelerating, and that's the thing, isn't it? Even
Yeah,
you've obviously been doing this for many years now. What, 22 odd
yeah,
years.
3 years, yeah.
I mean, and what the sort of changes that you've seen in that time? I guess that's right through the whole sort of smartphone development. Have you noticed a sort of trend over those years, or is it similar? People are showing up with similar type of just issues around reconnection.
Do you know, I sound like such a an old fart. Sorry, I'm not allowed to say that. But I think what really, really, really hits me is how little people talk to each other now.
Yeah,
I get really sad in restaurants or when I see families together and everyone is on their phone or
yeah,
on an iPad. It's just, I kind of, I think we've lost that ability to talk and just hang out together. There's always another person in either a game or a text running or a message running or social media running. It's just wherever you go. I remember there's a new development in Chelmsford at Bewley Park. And oh no, it was there, but another one hit me. I was at the station in Chelmsford, and there were two rooks having an enormous fight on the train lines, and there were people all sitting waiting for the train to come in. And this was like nature at its most spectacular and the
yeah,
raw. And nobody was looking. Everyone was on their phones. No, everyone's heads were down. There wasn't
yeah.
anybody looking up and taking note, but everyone was just absorbed into their phones. And I think we miss so much. We miss so much joy of looking into someone's face and their eyes, and we're just so fixed on screens. And I think that's the biggest change that I have seen in these last years. And it makes me kind of sad, because from an animal anthropological, I used to work as a social anthropologist. We need social contact. We need to look each other in the face. We need touch. We need connection. We need to belong. We need to be in a social group to feel safe and to be alive. And we're becoming more individualistic, becoming more alone or one in our way of living.
Yeah, and I
And COVID
think
made that worse, I think.
what what you said there's important to feel alive. I just think without that connection to something or someone, or that conversation, or that, you know, that touch of someone's hand, or that look in someone's eye, it just feels. And again, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think this is why there's that sort of malaise. There's a bit of a cultural malaise that people have just fallen into, because they're
Yeah,
missing those key ingredients of being human. And I had a
yeah,
lovely lady on the podcast called Laura Willis, who has got an organisation called Shine Offline, and her research, which went back to almost the start of the smartphone, said that our free time, i.e. the time that we can do what we wish with, about a year or two after the smartphone, had already jumped to about 50% screen time when they run that same test. And bearing in mind, this is pre-COVID and everything, this is 3 or 4 years ago, it was 97%. Of, on
no,
average, 97% of our free time now, like that real free time where you could be bored, you could, sit in nature, sit under your tree. 97%. I mean, imagine pre-COVID, it hasn't really got
no,
anywhere to go, has it? So we've
no,
almost sort of topped out in terms of the amount of time we're actually spending to spend time with people,
yeah,
reflect in nature. And it reminds me, over actually lockdown, we got a hot tub. We got one of those lazy boy spas, right? You couldn't go away. There was not a lot going on. So we said, let's just invest in that. And it was one of the best investments we've ever made as a family, because what we realized is, in there, one, we were outside effectively, in nature, in the garden, which was great, or looking at the stars, but there was no technology in there. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was this place, and it still is, where we get together as a family. All the good goss goes down in the hot tub, because it's probably one of the few places on the planet right now where we can go and there is no distraction. There isn't that sort of buzz, or one of the kids
mm,
has half got an eye on something, or a bit of a TV in the background. It's just this outside in nature, in our garden, and it's a blissful time. We connect and catch up, and I just can't help but think we just need more of this. And that's why I'm really drawn to what it is that you're doing at the Wilderness Foundation in all its different genres and guises, because it's just something that feels so incredibly necessary, more so now than like ever before.
Do you know, I think also it's really difficult, because I think we need to also almost try and help families find how to do this again. And I think, we've been running a fascinating project with women in domestic abuse, coming out surviving domestic abuse, and just the drama and the stress within family, and the pain and the hurt and all the different kind of dimensions. But also, if you throw poverty into it, and insecurity about money and food and safety, and people are so distracted in their own stuff that they don't really have the time or capacity to really be opening their arms out wide enough. And so everybody becomes more in their heads. And so therefore, even though you parent well and you want to be a good parent, you're so caught up in all the drama. And we were just talking earlier, I don't see many families eating together anymore. Most of our
Mm.
teenagers that we work with might forage in the kitchen, and then they go straight up to their bedroom and they game there, or they're on their phone, but they're not eating together. And I think it would be really lovely to do more family work. We already do family therapy, where we're trying to sort of help people learn how to deep listen, how to make space for each other, how to let other people have opinions, because actually you might have an opinion. It doesn't mean mine has to change, but I'm just giving you the space for yours, and just build up that kind of way of being together again, because I think we've lost it. And, I know some young people, a young person I worked with about 5 years ago, and she was desperately lonely, because she would come downstairs to try and make conversation with her parents, but they were on their phones all the time. And she said she'd come and sit in the lounge, but they wouldn't talk to her because they were just on their phones. And she'd be saying, can we chat? And they'd be, yeah, I'll be with you in a minute. Whoop, back to phones again. And I'm so glad your family's found the hot tub. And I think you can see that benefit and you can feel it. And your children will remember that for the rest of their lives, those times in the hot tub. Because actually, we don't really remember the times we're sitting all on our phones together. We remember the times we were doing something together or being together or connected together. That's
Yeah,
where our mind will disappear to.
I think that's so important again about the work that you're doing, because in some ways, there is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that's come into my mind, and it's well and good for me, in a fortunate position as a white male in society that's at a certain economic level that can afford to do certain things potentially that allow me to reflect and think about the bigger picture. And I can only imagine, as from an economic standpoint, if you're still in survival mode and you're just trying to get through, you've got bills to pay, you've got stresses, you've got a family to try and raise, the sort of being open to reconnecting with nature or feeling like you've got the time to do those things, my guess is that it would be a lot harder. So I'm assuming that the work that you're doing is obviously facilitating families to be able to do those type of things, which I think is important.
We tried during COVID to try and come up with a kind of a plan that people could follow on social media, and it was kind of like, if you live in a flat, how can I connect with nature? What things could I do with my kids if I've got two small children in a 2-bedroomed or a 2-roomed flat in Tower Hamlets? How could I, what could we do? How could we get outside? And it was things like, walking on the pavement and then counting how many different green plants we could see in the cracks, and almost building mindfulness things of touching leaves as you walk past someone's garden, and, trying to look at birds and saying, even though some of us were enabled to be in the countryside with gardens, but there were things we could still do, even if we lived in a busy city, and there were still bits of nature that were still there for us to touch into and to get the joy of. But we have to think about the person who lives in concrete and who hasn't got access. We have to think about, how do we really help those families or support them to get that mental health soothing that some of us have got on our doorstep? And how do we bring that equality of nature to everybody? We've talked about equality of wealth, but there's that natural heritage that's got an equality element to it too, as a human right. How do we make sure that we enable everybody to touch in? And I think schools have a role to play with children, but it's really important as a quest for me on a personal level and for the foundation, that we are making sure that we do everything we possibly can to help everybody have that ability to find a way to get that soothing and that connection. And it's interesting when you were talking about phones, Andy, there's some of the science around what goes on in our brains with nature. There's a theory. Sorry, my dogs are. I've switched everything else off not to disturb this
You can't
podcast.
switch the dogs off. Don't
I
worry
can't
about that.
switch the dogs off. I'm so sorry. There's some young people arriving for therapy at the office, and they've got their noses to the windows. They're very excited. So I think there's something called attention restoration therapy, and the Kaplans, who were really famous wilderness therapists, developed this kind of thinking with others. And it said that most of our lives, when we on that 97% with our eyes on a screen, it's what they call directed attention. So everything is just focused in. But when we're in nature, there's several processes that take place, and they call it soft fascination. So everything on your eye is softer, and also you're using more peripheral vision, and you're actually taking in different angles and landscapes and colors and textures on your eyes, which then are actually influencing what's going on in your brain. And so the outcomes of what they say with attention restoration therapy is the level of creativity that people come up with once they've been in nature. Because actually you've allowed the brain to actually soften and expand.
Yeah.
And we're not in this one-dimensional directed attention. We're actually allowing our brains to use all of its wonder and effects on it that allow our creativity to come up. So I know for myself, I write amazing poetry when I'm outside, and I can write really well when I'm outside. But when I'm back here at my desk, I feel a bit more stuck. But it's
Yeah.
just interesting. My brain works more creatively outdoors than it does indoors.
Yeah, it feels like there's been this sort of plethora of science around nature now, which has been really exciting, from forest bathing to what you just described there. And the way I read some research as well, which I found fascinating, was, and it made perfect sense to me. It was basically like when you're interacting in the concrete jungle, as it were. If you can imagine, your attention is firing off here, there, and everywhere. You've got to stop yourself getting run over by cars. You've got to deal with, beeps of horns. You've got to deal with people. And imagine what we're actually trying to do there by just almost using a lot of energy to not focus on all the things around, the peripheral, and just keep your sort of survival mode. Whereas in nature, you just switch all that off, because you're
Yeah.
obviously, it's a surrounding that you're so in tune with. So that was just so obvious for me. It was like, all right, yeah, I totally understand that. If I'm out in the wilderness, my brain is just totally at one and at ease. And of course, there's those rumblings in case there's a rustle in the bushes. But in general,
Absolutely.
it's absolutely switched off. Whereas you can imagine the same walk through a concrete jungle, and all the different stimulus and all the different things that he's got to almost block out to keep you on track to not get knocked down by a bus or whatever it is. It's a totally different world. And for me, that was, oh, I get it now. And then I
Yeah.
started to see all the further research around forest bathing and blood pressure and all of that. And is that something that's part of the work that you do now in terms of forest bathing or research, or do you sort of leverage that into what you do?
No, we're actually quite academic here. I mean, I'm a bit of a closet academic, I think. So we've been working with Essex University for about the last, oh gosh, since 2007, and
Wow.
measuring what happens to, so all of our work gets researched and evaluated. So we did a 10-year study using all of our turnaround statistics and what happened to young people through our programs. And what it showed is that the more connected you feel to nature, which is using kind of peer-led review questionnaires, the more your self-esteem improved, the more your mood changed in a positive direction, the higher your resilience, and the more of an increase in your hopefulness. And I was really interested in this discussion around hopefulness. And there's a great wilderness, therapy academic in the States called Keith Russell. He's my big hero. You know how you develop these heroes in
Yeah.
academia? You just think, oh, wonderful. And Keith Russell, developed the Hopefulness Score, because the idea is that if you're not hopeful, you think of your motivational work. If you haven't got anything to hope for, why would you bother to do
Mm.
anything? So we've been measuring connectedness to nature and hopefulness, and we can demonstrate through these extraordinary graphs and statistics and bar charts the significant change in how people grow and develop and feel as a result of being more connected to nature. So we are very, very interested in it, and I'm a very passionate about reading and understanding more and more as much as I can, and looking at all the different theories and the different sort of practices about where the neurological changes are coming and why are they coming and what's actually happening in our brains, what's happening with our eyes. Our eyes seem to be quite an important interpreter for our connection to nature and how that affects the brain. So there's a whole lot of research on something called fractal patterns, which are those repetitive patterns you see in snowflakes. And they talk about the repetitive patterns of leaves, the veins in leaves and
Mm.
trees, and how the branches come out. Um, and, how those kind of fractal patterns falling on the eye have a kind of, again, a soothing effect on the brain.
Wow.
It's re-earthing us,
Yeah.
possibly back to, the primitive kind of connection of which we were in for much longer than we've been in now. And ideas around the study of awe and wonder. What happens when we're in a place of great beauty or splendor. What then happens in terms of our mental state. And one of the
Mm.
lovely things in that is that the ego seems to go down and the sense of social awareness comes up. So, and that sense of the other, when you look at
Mm.
something really, really beautiful outside, or you get a swell in your heart that then connects you to the world and to the earth and to something bigger than yourself, and that again creates connection and is soothing for us. And I think it's quite simple, and I cried on the way to work this morning because there was a survivor of the Twin Towers talking on Radio 4 this morning. And she was sort of talking about how hard it was, how many people had helped her and she didn't help anybody. And then she said, and then I just go into my garden and I plunge my fingers into the soil. And she said something then happens and I can feel okay again. I can feel that I'm not alone. I'm not cast out. I'm reconnected and re-earthed. And it was just, honestly, I just sobbed all the way to work in the car, just listening to this.
Beautiful.
It was so touching. And for her and for all of and Monday we had a reunion of our domestic abuse women, and one woman just talked so deeply about what's been going on in her world, but then coming to us where the view from our outdoor safari tent into trees and long grass and the birds are singing, and she just said, I suddenly just feel okay again. I kind of feel at peace now. I'm back in a space where I can stop breathing so shallowly and so panicky. I can settle. I can settle here. So and if we don't settle, we can't deal with our problems. We can't work in a reptilian brain of fight, flight, or freeze. We can't come up with good thinking that really helps us and others because we're just too frozen or too panicked. So, a lot of the people that come in our doors have been addicts, and there's something that with what you've started and the addictions are only there because there's been something really painful or difficult and unable to resolve. And so you have to soothe yourself. I have to find something to soothe myself. And it can be sex and work and alcohol and drugs but nature can soothe us. So it's almost like a kind of a vitamin N bottle we've got there to help people.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to me, and nature's definitely been soothing to me over the last 10 years. It's always been a big part of my life, but especially so since I stopped drinking, for example, and set out my own quest in that way, that I've spent a lot of time in nature. It's almost a joke that I would go to the woods every day and do my Facebook lives from the woods, and I love showing people around over Faundon. And to that note, the sort of spiritual moments, for want of a better word, that connection with something bigger always happens in those moments of nature. I haven't experienced it anywhere else like that. It just seems to happen that you find yourself, I'll turn a corner and into a meadow and the sun's shining, or just coming up over the hill, and there's that sense there's something bigger at play, which is, it's so warming, at every level, in every sort of fiber of your body. There's something magical that happens, and I can only imagine again that if it must be a necessary part of being a human, that we need those bones of ours warmed at times just through the simplicity and the beauty of awe and wonder of nature. And I think that's what's so important, again, with the work that you're doing, allowing people to have that and earth themselves, to put their fingers back in the soil. And funnily enough, that's something that I do. I'll often bend down and literally there's an overwhelming urge to put my fingers like into especially when you get into the real deep woods and it's like that dark, peaty, I just want to put my fingers in there. Or I'll lean up against, I have to do stealth tree hugging, I've got to admit. So I can't get in there for the full, so I lean up against it as if I'm doing a calf stretch, because I've normally got my running gear on, but secretly what I'm doing is breathing in to the tree, and there's again, if you put your hands on the bark of a tree, there's something unbelievably, it's just, I can't quite describe it. I can't put my fingers on it literally, but there's something about that, there's all of these things I think are so inherent to what it is to be human. And I think it's just such a beautiful thing that we're trying to encourage people to do that or facilitate that. And then on that note, just something that I wanted to get to, I'm conscious of your time, I don't want to keep you for too long, but was about climate as well. And I noticed that you're looking at that. What is your view for that? We're talking about hope through being in nature, because I started to really get interested in climate change. I bought all the books, as I do, and I think I read the first two, and then I was like, I can't read anymore. I literally couldn't read anymore. It was filling me with apocalyptic dread to the point that I was like, I just don't think this is actually helpful for me. It's not beneficial. I'm actually in fear of, literally my life and my children's life, which in some ways could be extremely motivational to do something. But for me, it was almost overwhelming. So I don't know what your thoughts are around what we can do and where we're at. I know it's a huge ask.
I mean, I'm a commissioner with the Essex Climate Change Commission, and do you know, I I was talking to someone about this morning. I said I think we've got to make people sit up and realize that this is really serious, because it is really serious. But we've got to do it in such a way that we don't just terrify people who then switch off. And I think sometimes working with teenagers who marginalized, and I hate that definition, but who are a bit kind of lost, I don't think they're getting the desperation, and I don't think they're getting the action. They're kind of hanging in the middle, and they're just not really understanding. But I think there's been some really interesting research in Essex about what people are doing and who's doing what. And there's an army of young people who've got really active about it. I think we've got to be very careful not to get elitist, like I'm really good and you really bad, because I think that's what humans often go into, that sort of frame, but I think what I'd like to do is to sort of, if everybody had their checklist in their kitchen about 10 commitments that each family makes, and this is what we are going to do as a family. I know that, particularly on the Climate Change Commission, one of the things we've really, really talked about was food and diet. And I'm constantly trying to be a good vegetarian, but I cheat all the time because I'm just a bit lazy in my structure. But I'd love to be. I'm still also, sometimes I don't think veganism is so good for the planet. Not There are lots of things that we're doing good, but they've got another consequence. And I don't think being a vegetarian always is good for the planet, and I don't think being a meat eater is good for the planet. So none of us can find the right thing that we can absolutely 100% say what we're doing is absolutely right. But what has definitely come out of our work with the Climate Commission is that plant-based eating is probably the best thing we can be doing, as well as, really watching how we utilize things like plastic, how much we're traveling by plane, how much we are actually driving, what kind of cars we're driving. And then not everybody can afford at this stage to make some of those changes. So it's trying to maybe have a list of things that we can all commit to on a sliding scale. And so long as we're all conscious, we all know that this is a really big, big issue coming towards us. We're already in it, it's not coming towards us. But if everybody did something, it would make a big difference. And I think there's something about communication, and there's something about how we don't make it, as I said just now, elitist, that everybody has their own sense of power of what they can do themselves and not feel disempowered. And I'm not quite sure how we do that. I mean, we've talked a lot about community engagement. I think there's a lot more to maybe help schools to really kind of get young people really, really thinking in a fresh way, although I think a lot of them are already. I think my generation are very good at recycling, but we're not very good at driving better cars. We're not very good at being plant-based. The kind of 50, 60, 70-year-olds are actually living very austerely. I mean, my husband is an incredibly passionate, green liver. The lights are all off and we're stumbling around in the dark, and, recycles everything, use as little plastic as we can. We try and do that. But yet when I did my WWF check on my climate change, I'm not doing enough. But I think, we rewilded our garden. We're doing as much as I think we can do, but we could probably do some more. But
I think
it's
that's the
not
key,
making
isn't it?
people feel bad. I think we
Yeah.
can't make anybody feel bad.
Otherwise, people switch off, on a
Absolutely.
mass scale. And I think you're right. It's doing what you can, bases as much information as you have, whether that's moving towards more plant-based or whether it's making sure you recycle or turning your lights off. And ultimately, I think that's what we have to hope for, and that's collectively can move the needle in some shape or form. I mean, it is incredibly worrying. It's something that I'm growing more passionate about by the minute, and it's somewhere where I definitely want to spend a bit more of my time researching and understanding it, because I think it is really important to educate and understand as well, so that you don't just get caught up in the scaremongering, or you don't get caught up in the he said she said of it all. It's like, what can I actually do that's going to make a difference collectively, and maybe that's something down the line that I'll definitely get more involved in, because it is for I think all of us, our generation and the generations to come, the big thing really that we need to focus on.
I think unfortunately, I think a lot of it also has to do with our relationship with the natural world and our
Yeah.
disconnection. Because I think we're living a very disconnected life and we don't think about the electricity we're using unless we're paying by a meter. And we don't think about the water in a tap because we just switch it on and off. And, I think that's what I love about wilderness work is because everything is completely real. If I need water, I've got to walk to the river and carry it up in a bag. And I haven't got electricity. I've got to make light out of a torch. I mean, probably my torch battery is doing some terrible disservice to the planet through lithium. But I think that the more connected we feel to nature, the more I think we're inclined to want to look after the natural world.
Yeah.
And climate change and the natural world come together. And I think if we understand that the healthier the climate, the healthier the climate, the healthier the planet, the healthier we are, that actually, I wanted to make a point about you leaning on your trees because I love that. And, one of the things we forget is our DNA is so closely linked to trees. I think it's something like 80 something percent of
Wow.
our DNA we share with trees. I mean, how bonkers is that?
Yeah.
So, you know, we aren't, we've kind of learned to be the dominant species, but we're just one of a whole planet of species. And the more we can get humble and the more we can actually start to see ourselves in relation to the rest of the natural world, then I think that climate change and the way we behave will soften. But we've just been too big and too strong. We've been too able to just completely charge through everything. And now I think we're starting to soften a bit. I think
Mm.
David Attenborough has done a good job. He reaches so many hearts and
Yeah.
minds. People like yourself who are influential, who are interested, who are questing, who are thinking, you'll be able to change hearts and minds.
Mm.
We're educating around 6,000 children a year when there's no COVID here on site
Wow.
around their connection to the natural world. We've just got to keep doing it, but not making people feel bad, not but still exciting people that we've all got to work together because it's huge. I mean, when you look at the statistics of flooding in Essex,
Mm.
I mean, it is horrendous what we're looking at coming into the future. You're looking at the heat, you're looking at drought, you're looking at water shortages. There's just an enormous amount coming towards us, and for our children's sake, we have to act. We have to do what we can.
Yeah, and I think that's the key bit. For me, that was watching the David Attenborough documentary, funnily enough, that you mentioned as well. And actually, I teed it up and I watched it and said to my girls, I've got teenage girls, 12 and 15, or sort of 12 and 14 at the time. And I was like, right, we have to sit down and watch this documentary. And the truth was, both of them were really fearful. They knew what the documentary was going to be. They knew, the punchline at the end. And it was really difficult for them because instantly it raised those questions. And I could see the fear in their eyes of, is our planet, is it doomed? Is it what's going on? And it was a really powerful experience for me. And I sort of put on my superhero dad pants and was like, right, that's it. Your dad's going to do something about it. And, and I feel like I haven't actually done anywhere near enough. And, in truth, and I'm someone that is really engaged and really interested, and these are the things you think, do you know what, I think it does need some deep thought and for everyone, myself included, to get out there and do as much as we can because it does really make a difference. And then on that
Yeah.
note, I'm just conscious of your time, but I really want people to know where they can help or get involved. How does that work within the foundation?
Yeah, well, as I said, our head office is based at Chatham Green, and we're on a beautiful 400-acre site, and we've got a 100-acre wood that we've got a license for nearby.
Oh wow.
We really need help with funding for our therapy sessions. We've just run out of face-to-face funding. The more money we raise, the more sessions we offer, and it's gone. The mental health crisis is through the roof. So if anybody can help us with kind of getting more funding in for our therapy, we'd be ever so grateful. And that's for group and individual therapy. We've got a lot of people out there who are significantly struggling, and a lot of young people and adults who've lost the point of life. And, our work is to try and really help them discover that there is a point. we've been given a life, and what are we going to do with it, and how do we make that work for the best for everybody? And then, we are really short of mentors. So we run our outdoor therapy programs, and we train our mentors. And we have mentors who work one-to-one with young people at their own convenience. But we really need our day mentors. So all of our group work relies really heavily on our volunteers who are trained and support the young people and adults on our programs. And they're part of our team. We're cooking, we're eating, we're talking and sharing together. And we really need that kind of level of support and help. We're building an ambassador team, so people who would be willing to be ambassadors for wilderness and our values. We're really keen to talk to anybody who wants to try and help us with getting the word out. And we're looking for, PR or media or office volunteering. We've got our allotment in Chelmsford with significantly disabled young people. And we're looking for people who might enjoy vegetable gardening and who would like to work side by side with youngsters who are struggling, young adults, and who are just the most beautiful human beings. And my husband volunteers, and it's just a very inspiring place to be. And if anybody knows of anyone who's retired or time on their hands who's good with woodwork, we're looking for another carpenter to come and work with our special education needs, young people outside building and making benches and doing things in the outdoors. So on our website are our different volunteer activities. But, we're a very good, fun, loving, good team, and we really appreciate and value all of our volunteers and support team immensely.
Wonderful. I've been inspired. There's the
The
dogs off again.
dogs,
And
sorry.
just finally, where's the website that people should go to, or the best point of contact?
So thank you, Andy. It's www.wildernessfoundation.org.uk, so org.uk. That's where people can find out more about us. And we've got a lot of social media channels that you can link onto on our website as well, and sign up for our newsletter. And if anyone's passing Chatham Green, pop by and come and say hello and
I
meet some of the team.
will 100% be coming over to say hello. And I'm sure putting this podcast out, there's lots of people in the Essex area and surrounding that hopefully will be inspired about this conversation, that will be in touch, which would be
Thank you, Andy. And come for a
fabulous.
walk. Come for a walk and a lean on a tree.
100%.
We'd love to have you.
Yeah, will do. And thank you for spending some time with me today. You're really good. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Cool.
Bye.